You wake up every morning and put on the same mask you wore yesterday, the same forced smile, the same automatic responses to questions you have heard 1,000 times, the same routine that seems to stretch endlessly before you, like a desert highway under a merciless sun. You brush your teeth looking at a reflection that feels more and more like a stranger, someone playing a role in a movie you never auditioned for. The face staring back at you carries the weight of countless compromises, small betrayals of your authentic self that have accumulated over years like dust on a forgotten mirror. Your colleagues see you as reliable. Your family depends on your presence. Your friends invite you to gatherings where you laugh at all the right moments, but inside, something is screaming. Something deep within you is pleading for permission to disappear, not in the sense of physical death, but in the profound sense of allowing the person you think you are to dissolve completely. This feeling intensifies during the most mundane moments. When you are sitting in traffic, your hands gripping the steering wheel while your mind drifts to places your body cannot follow. When you are in meetings that seem to drain the very life force from your being, discussing projects that feel meaningless against the backdrop of your soul's deeper longing. When you are lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of another day lived on autopilot settling into your bones like lead. You feel it most acutely in those quiet moments between sleep and waking, when the weight of your constructed identity hasn't yet settled back onto your shoulders. In those precious seconds, you remember something essential about yourself that the daylight world seems determined to make you forget. That voice, barely audible but persistent, whispering that the life you are living is not the life your soul came here to experience. It speaks to you in dreams that you barely remember upon waking, dreams where you are someone entirely different, someone free from the invisible chains that bind you to this half-lived existence. You have learned to silence it with busyness, with responsibilities, with the endless noise of a world that rewards conformity and punishes authentic transformation. You turn up the volume on your distractions, bury yourself deeper in work, in relationships, in activities that promise to fill the void but only seem to make it larger. But the voice persists, growing stronger with each passing year, each unfulfilled moment, each time you choose safety over truth, comfort over growth, the known prison over the unknown freedom. Today, I want you to know that this calling you have been ignoring is not a sign of weakness or mental instability. It is perhaps the most sacred invitation your soul will ever extend to your conscious mind. What you are experiencing is what the great scholar of religion Mircea Eliade understood as the fundamental cry of the human soul for initiation. Throughout his extensive research into the religious life of humanity, spanning decades of meticulous study across hundreds of cultures and traditions, Eliade discovered that in every culture, across every continent, and throughout all of recorded history, there exists this profound recognition that true spiritual maturity requires what he called a ritual death and rebirth. From the shamanic traditions of Siberia to the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, from the vision quests of Native American tribes to the monastic retreats of medieval Christianity, every authentic spiritual tradition has understood that the person you believe yourself to be, with all your accumulated fears, limiting beliefs, and societal programming, is not your true nature. It is a construction, a carefully built fortress of habits, thoughts, and reactions that was once necessary for your survival, but has now become the very prison that separates you from the sacred dimension of existence. This false self, what Eliade called the profane identity, is like a costume that has become so familiar you have forgotten you are wearing it. You have identified so completely with your roles, your history, your personality patterns, that you mistake these temporary phenomena for your eternal essence. Ancient peoples understood this illusion so deeply that they created elaborate ceremonies to help individuals die to their old selves and be reborn into their authentic spiritual identity. In the Australian Aboriginal tradition, young men would be taken into the wilderness and subjected to experiences so intense that their ordinary sense of self would completely dissolve, allowing their true spiritual nature to emerge. The initiate would be taken away from everything familiar, stripped of their social identity, deprived of comfort and certainty, and guided through a process that Eliade described as a return to the primordial chaos from which all creation emerges. They would face their deepest fears, confront the parts of themselves they had been taught to suppress, and ultimately discover that what they thought was their identity was merely a collection of borrowed ideas and conditioned responses. In the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, initiates would drink a sacred potion and experience visions so profound that they would emerge speaking of having been completely transformed, no longer afraid of death, because they had experienced their own immortal nature directly. The The Hindu tradition speaks of the ego death that occurs during deep meditation, when the meditator realizes that the small self they thought was real is simply a wave on the infinite ocean of consciousness. But in our modern world, we have lost these wisdom traditions, leaving millions of people trapped between two worlds, the familiar prison of their constructed self and the vast unknown territory of their authentic being. We have therapists instead of shamans, medications instead of sacred plants, self-help books instead of initiation rites, and while these modern approaches have their place, they often fail to address the fundamental spiritual crisis that underlies so much of our contemporary suffering. The disappearance your soul is calling for is not an escape from life, but a return to life in its most essential form. When Eliade studied the initiation rites of indigenous cultures around the world, he noticed a consistent pattern that reveals something profound about human nature. The initiate must first experience what he called the dissolution of profane identity. Everything that the person believed about themselves, their role in society, their fears, their ambitions, even their name, must be temporarily surrendered. This is not destruction for its own sake, but a necessary clearing of space for something far more authentic to emerge. Consider the powerful example of the Lakota vision quest, where a young person would go alone into the wilderness for 4 days and nights without food or water, sitting in a small circle of stones waiting for a vision that would reveal their true spiritual name and purpose. During this time, everything they had been taught about who they were would fall away under the intensity of hunger, thirst, exposure to the elements, and complete solitude. They would face their deepest fears, their sense of separation, their attachment to comfort and security, until finally, in a moment of complete surrender, their true spiritual nature would reveal itself.
In the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, initiates spoke of experiencing their own death while still alive, describing a journey through darkness so complete that they emerged on the other side as fundamentally different beings. They would enter the sacred chamber believing themselves to be ordinary mortals and emerge knowing themselves to be immortal souls temporarily inhabiting human form.
The mystery schools of Egypt subjected initiates to elaborate rituals that simulated death and burial, followed by a symbolic resurrection that marked their entrance into a completely new level of consciousness. The Aboriginal walkabout, where young people would wander alone in the wilderness for months, surviving on their wits and their connection to the land, learning to see through the eyes of the ancestors and to hear the songs that the earth itself was singing. The vision quest of Native American traditions, where individuals would fast alone on a mountaintop for days, seeking a vision that would guide the rest of their lives. The 3 days and nights Jesus spent in the tomb before his resurrection, the 40 days Moses spent alone on Mount Sinai before receiving the commandments, the Buddha's extended meditation under the Bodhi tree before his enlightenment, all point to the same universal truth. Authentic spiritual transformation requires a willingness to let the false self dissolve completely. Your soul knows this ancient wisdom, even when your mind resists it. That restless feeling, that sense that you are living someone else's life, that persistent whisper asking you to disappear, is your own inner wisdom recognizing that you have outgrown the container of your current identity and are ready for a profound metamorphosis. The caterpillar does not resist becoming a butterfly because it understands that its current form must dissolve for its true nature to emerge. But humans, with our complex minds and attachments to our personal history, often fight this natural process of transformation, clinging to the familiar, even when it has become a source of suffering. This is why you feel so exhausted by the effort it takes to maintain your current identity. Like an actor who has been playing the same role for decades, you have forgotten that it is just a performance. The businessman, the mother, the student, the retiree, whatever role you have been assigned or have chosen, these are all temporary costumes worn by the eternal being that you truly are. But unlike a professional actor who can take off their costume at the end of the day, you have been wearing yours for so long that it has begun to feel like your skin. You wake up tired not because your body needs more rest, but because your soul is exhausted from the constant effort of pretending to be someone you are not. Every day requires tremendous energy to maintain the facade, to remember your lines, to react in the expected ways, to suppress the impulses and insights that don't fit the character you have been playing. You find yourself saying things you don't really mean, agreeing to commitments that drain your spirit, pursuing goals that once excited you but now feel hollow and meaningless. You smile when you feel like crying. You say you are fine when you are anything but fine. You participate in conversations that feel like elaborate performances where everyone is reciting lines from a script no one remembers writing. Eliade observed that modern humans suffer from what he called the terror of history, a deep anxiety about meaning and purpose that arises when we become too identified with our temporary roles and lose connection with our timeless essence. We begin to believe that our worth depends on our achievements, our security depends on our possessions, Our identity depends on other people's opinions of us. We become trapped in what he called linear time, always rushing towards some future goal or haunted by past mistakes, never able to rest in the eternal present where our true nature resides. Traditional cultures avoided this crisis by regularly creating opportunities for individuals to remember their true nature through ritual death and rebirth. They understood that the human psyche needs periodic reminders that we are more than our social roles, more than our personal history, more than the collection of thoughts and emotions that we typically identify as ourselves. The medicine man would die to his ordinary consciousness during his shamanic journey and be reborn as a bridge between the human and divine worlds, able to access knowledge and power that was completely unavailable to his everyday personality. The warrior would die to his fear and personal attachments during his vision quest and be reborn as a protector of the sacred, no longer fighting for personal glory but serving something far greater than himself. The mother would die to her selfish desires during the birth process and be reborn as a channel for the creative force of the universe, understanding that the child she carried was not her possession, but a sacred trust. Each initiation was a small death that led to a larger life, a temporary disappearance that resulted in a more authentic presence, a dissolution of the false self that allowed the true self to shine through more brilliantly. You know what touches me most when I read your messages? It's realizing that we're not alone in this search. If you're listening to me now and feel that emptiness, that sensation that something important is missing in your life, I want you to know that I understand exactly what you're going through. There were moments when I also felt completely disconnected from the sacred, lost in the midst of a routine that seemed to suck all the magic out of existence. That's why I want to ask you a very direct question. What was the last moment you felt there was something greater than yourself present in your life? It could have been contemplating a sunset, listening to music, or simply in an instant of silence. If you feel comfortable, write in the comments, "I miss the sacred in my daily life," and briefly tell when that last moment was. Your story might be exactly what someone needs to read today to feel less alone in this journey. And I promise I'll read each comment with the care it deserves. The calling to disappear that your soul keeps whispering is actually an invitation to remember what Eliade called your primordial nature. Before you learn to define yourself through your achievements, your relationships, your possessions, or your social status, there was a you that existed in perfect connection with the sacred dimension of reality. This original self knew without doubt that it was part of something infinitely larger and more meaningful than the small dramas of daily life. If you think back to your earliest memories, you might remember moments when you felt this connection naturally and effortlessly. Perhaps you recall lying on your back in the grass, staring up at the clouds, feeling yourself dissolving into the vastness of the sky, or sitting by a river, completely mesmerized by the play of light on water, losing all sense of time and self in the beauty of the moment. Maybe you remember the feeling of absolute safety and love you experienced while being held by someone who cared for you, a sense of belonging so complete that there was no separation between you and the love that surrounded you. Children often live from this place naturally, which is why they can spend hours completely absorbed in simple activities, finding magic in the most ordinary moments. They can have entire conversations with imaginary friends, transform a cardboard box into a spaceship, or become completely fascinated by the way dust particles dance in a beam of sunlight. They have not yet learned to separate themselves from the world around them, to create the artificial barriers between subject and object, self and other, sacred and mundane, that characterize adult consciousness. A child can look at a flower and see not just a plant but a miracle, not just petals and stems but a manifestation of the divine creative force that brings all things into being. They can feel genuine love for a stuffed animal, real grief when a pet dies, authentic joy in the simple pleasure of running or laughing or singing. But as we grow older, we learn to suppress this awareness in favor of fitting into a world that seems to value productivity over presence, doing over being, having over becoming. We are taught that imagination is not real, that feelings are not important, that the sense of magic and wonder we naturally felt as children is naive and impractical. We learn to see the world through the lens of utility rather than beauty, to measure everything by its usefulness rather than its intrinsic worth. We begin to live in our heads instead of our hearts, in concepts rather than direct experience, in the realm of thoughts about life rather than life itself. The disappearance your soul is requesting is a return to this state of primordial awareness, not as a permanent escape from responsibility, but as a source of authentic power and wisdom from which to engage with life more fully. When you remember your original nature, you discover that you have access to creativity, intuition, compassion, and clarity that were completely unavailable to your constructed personality. You begin to see solutions to problems that once seemed impossible, to find meaning in experiences that once felt empty, to experience love and joy that is not dependent on external circumstances. The resistance you feel to this calling is completely natural and even necessary for the process to work correctly. Eliade understood that the terror experienced by initiates was not a sign that they were going in the wrong direction, but evidence that they were approaching the threshold between two worlds. The ego, which has worked so hard to construct and maintain your current identity, will resist this dissolution with every tool at its disposal. It will tell you that you cannot afford to disappear, that too many people depend on you, that this is selfish or irresponsible, that you should be grateful for the life you have built. It will remind you of all the time and energy you have invested in becoming who you are, all the achievements and relationships that define your worth, all the security and comfort that your current identity provides. It will paint terrifying pictures of what might happen if you let go of your familiar sense of self, suggesting that you might lose everything you have worked for, that people might abandon you, that you might discover that underneath your carefully constructed personality there is nothing at all. These are not evil thoughts, but the natural protective mechanisms of a psyche that mistakes the constructed self for reality. The ego is not your enemy, but rather a part of your consciousness that has become confused about its proper role. Like a security guard who has been working the same shift for years, it has developed an exaggerated sense of its own importance and sees threats everywhere, even in experiences that would actually be beneficial for your growth and well-being. It has forgotten that its job is to protect your true nature, not to prevent you from discovering what that true nature actually is. In traditional cultures, this resistance was honored and worked with skillfully. The elders knew that the initiate needed to feel the full weight of what they were being asked to surrender before they could genuinely choose transformation. The process was never forced but always invited, never demanded but always available for those whose souls were ready for the journey. The shamans understood that resistance was a sign that the ego was taking the process seriously, that the transformation being offered was real enough to threaten the false self's sense of control. They would often increase the intensity of the initiation precisely when the initiate's resistance was strongest, knowing that this was the moment when breakthrough was most likely to occur. In the Lakota Sundance ceremony, warriors would dance for days under the blazing sun, their flesh pierced by wooden skewers, until their ordinary consciousness was so overwhelmed by pain and exhaustion that they had no choice but to surrender to something greater than their personal will. In the Tibetan tradition of Chod practice, meditators would go alone to frightening places like charnel grounds and cemeteries, deliberately confronting their deepest fears until they realized that what they had been afraid of was ultimately illusory. The Greek mystery schools would subject initiates to terrifying experiences designed to strip away their attachment to their ordinary sense of self, knowing that only when the ego was completely overwhelmed would the soul's true nature have space to emerge. What makes this calling so difficult for modern people is that we have lost the cultural support systems that once guided individuals through this profound transition safely. In ancient times, when someone felt the call to disappear into their authentic nature, they were surrounded by a community that understood and honored this process. The entire tribe or village would participate in supporting the initiate's transformation, creating sacred space for the dissolution of the old self and the emergence of the new. There were guides who had made this journey themselves and knew the territory intimately, elders who could recognize the signs that someone was ready for initiation and could provide appropriate guidance and protection throughout the process. There were rituals that provided structure and meaning for the experience, transforming what could otherwise be a terrifying descent into chaos into a sacred journey with clear stages and a promised return. There was a cultural narrative that made sense of what was happening, giving the initiate confidence that what they were experiencing was not madness, but a natural and necessary part of human development. Most importantly, there was a community waiting to welcome them back when the process was complete, ready to honor their transformation and help them integrate their new understanding into daily life. Today, we are often left to navigate this transformation alone, with no map and no support, in a culture that not only fails to understand the process, but actively discourages it. We live in a society that values consistency over growth, security over authenticity, conformity over transformation. The very idea of disappearing into your true nature is seen as threatening to a system that depends on people maintaining predictable roles and behaviors. We are expected to choose a career path in our teens and stick with it for life, to develop a personality in our 20s and never change it, to establish relationships and maintain them in exactly the same form forever. Any deviation from this program is seen as instability, irresponsibility, or mental illness. This is why so many people either ignore the calling entirely, pushing it down with work, relationships, substances, or entertainment, or attempt to answer it in destructive ways that cause more harm than healing. Addiction, in many cases, is a misguided attempt to experience ego dissolution without proper guidance or support. The alcoholic or drug addict is seeking the same transcendence that the mystic finds in meditation, the same release from the prison of the constructed self that the initiate finds in sacred ceremony. But without understanding or structure, this search for transcendence becomes a compulsive escape that destroys rather than transforms. Depression, too, can be understood as a form of spiritual crisis, the soul's attempt to force the ego into surrender. When it refuses to listen to gentler invitations, the depressed person often speaks of feeling empty, meaningless, disconnected from life, unable to find purpose in their daily activities. These are precisely the feelings that traditional cultures would recognize as signs that someone was ready for initiation, ready to die to their old way of being and be reborn into a more authentic existence. But in our culture, these symptoms are pathologized and medicated rather than honored as a call to transformation. Midlife crisis, spiritual bypassing, workaholism, chronic anxiety, these are all misguided attempts to answer the soul's call for authentic transformation. The person having a midlife crisis is responding to the realization that the identity they have spent decades building feels empty and meaningless. But instead of using this realization as an opportunity for genuine spiritual transformation, they often just try to construct a new identity that will provide the same illusion of security and purpose. The spiritual bypasser uses spiritual practices and concepts to avoid dealing with the practical realities of human existence, trying to disappear into blissful states rather than doing the difficult work of integrating their spiritual insights into daily life. If you've been wondering whether what you are experiencing is truly a spiritual calling or simply dissatisfaction with your circumstances, Eliade's research provides clear guidance for recognizing the signs of authentic soul initiation. The first sign is a growing sense of unreality about your everyday life, as if you are watching yourself play a role rather than living authentically. The second sign is an increasing sensitivity to the sacred dimension of reality. You may find yourself moved to tears by natural beauty, or suddenly aware of a profound intelligence operating behind daily life. The third sign is a growing intolerance for superficial activities and conversations. The fourth sign is an intense longing for solitude and silence, not as escape but as a return to your essential nature. The practical path of responding to your soul's call for disappearance begins with creating small spaces of dissolution in your daily life. You do not need to abandon your responsibilities or dramatically alter your external circumstances to begin this process. Eliade discovered that the sacred can break through into ordinary reality in the smallest of moments when we are genuinely open to it. Start by setting aside time each day to sit quietly without any agenda, allowing yourself to experience what it feels like to exist without trying to be anyone in particular. This might feel uncomfortable at first because you are so accustomed to defining yourself through action and thought, but gradually, you will begin to remember the peace and clarity that exist beneath all the noise of your constructed identity. Pay attention to the moments when you naturally forget yourself, when you are completely absorbed in a beautiful piece of music, when you are moved by the sight of light filtering through leaves, when you are present with a loved one without any agenda other than simple appreciation. These are glimpses of your authentic nature, small deaths of the ego that point toward the larger transformation your soul is requesting. Notice also the activities and environments that make you feel most alive and connected to something larger than yourself. For some people, this might be time in nature. For others, it might be creative expression, meditation, service to others, or deep conversation about meaningful topics. These are not just preferences but clues about the particular way your soul wants to reconnect with the sacred dimension of existence. If you have been feeling this calling for a long time, I want you to know that your patience with the process is not a sign of weakness, but of deep wisdom. The soul operates on a completely different timeline than the ego. While your mind wants transformation to happen quickly and efficiently, your soul knows that authentic change requires time, patience, and a willingness to trust processes that cannot be controlled or predicted. Your soul has been calling you to disappear, not because you are broken or lacking, but because you are ready for a level of authenticity and spiritual maturity that your current identity cannot contain. One of the most beautiful aspects of this process is that it ultimately leads not to isolation but to genuine connection. When you begin to live from your authentic nature rather than your constructed personality, you become available for real relationship, in a way that was previously impossible. The masks we wear to protect ourselves also prevent others from truly seeing and knowing us. As you allow parts of your false self to dissolve, you create space for others to be authentic in your presence as well. This is why spiritual communities throughout history have formed around shared practices of ego dissolution and spiritual rebirth. The most radical thing you can do in a culture that worships false identity is to gradually become nobody in particular. This does not mean becoming passive or withdrawing from life, but rather engaging with life from a place of such deep authenticity that you are no longer controlled by the need to maintain any particular image of yourself. Eliade observed that the most spiritually mature individuals in traditional cultures were often those who had died to their personal agendas and been reborn as servants of something far larger than themselves. As we reach the end of our time together, I want to leave you with this deep truth that Eliade spent his entire life exploring and teaching. The calling you feel to disappear is not a problem to be solved, but a sacred invitation to be honored. Your soul is not trying to destroy you, but to liberate you from a prison you may not even realize you have been living in. The person you think you are is just the first draft of who you came here to become. The restlessness, the sense that something is missing, the quiet voice asking you to let go of everything familiar. These are not signs that something is wrong with your life, but evidence that your life is ready to become something far more beautiful and meaningful than you have yet imagined. The ancient wisdom traditions all point to the same liberating truth. You are not who you think you are, and who you really are is far more magnificent than your mind could ever comprehend. Your soul knows this, which is why it keeps calling you home to yourself, keeps inviting you to disappear into the vast mystery of your own authentic being. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognizes that there's a different path, a deeper way to understand your own spiritual journey. I know what it's like to feel lost amid so much noise of the modern world, seeking answers that always seem to slip through your fingers. That's why I created this space, this refuge where we can explore together the ancient wisdom that still pulses alive in our hearts. When you subscribe to this channel, you're not just clicking a button, you're joining a community of people who, like you, feel that life has deeper layers waiting to be discovered. Here you'll find not just knowledge, but genuine embrace for your thirst for meaning. Subscribe now and be part of this journey of rediscovering the sacred in everyday life. Your soul deserves this gift. The path forward is simpler than your mind wants to believe and more profound than your heart has dared to hope. Begin today by creating small moments of sacred disappearance in your life. Sit quietly and allow yourself to exist without trying to be anyone in particular. Pay attention to the activities and environments that make you feel most connected to something larger than yourself. Practice seeing the sacred dimension of ordinary experiences. Trust the process even when you cannot understand it. And remember that every time you choose authenticity over image, presence over productivity, being over doing, you are honoring your soul's deepest calling and contributing to the awakening of consciousness on this planet. The world needs people who are willing to disappear into their true nature, not fewer of them. Your courage to answer this calling is a gift not just to yourself, but to everyone whose life you touch. The sacred is calling you home to yourself, and the time is now.